Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, this bill, this piece of legislation is long overdue. I don't think there will be a single sensible person in the industry or otherwise that can put forward any justification as to why an industry such as the private security industry should not be regulated. That's the first point. The regulation of this industry, Madam Speaker, is long overdue. As the member for Oropouche East pointed out somewhere in his contribution, the persons who are employed in this industry are not the persons who are the higher levels of our society, unfortunately. In fact, this is an industry, if we're being honest here today, where there is a tremendous amount of exploitation of persons. And it is irresponsible for anyone to say that there should not be regulation of this industry, and it is not long overdue. To set the record straight and to remind the population, through you, Madam Speaker, there were 11 meetings of this Joint Select Committee. There is nothing that is complex about the regulation of this industry. We're talking about the necessary regulation of private security firms. Immediately you understand that to mean that you should be regulating the owners of the company as to whether they should be granted licenses, and also regulating through license those who will work on the streets, those who will be charged with the responsibility and the dangerous responsibility of finding themselves sometimes in very secluded places, alone, without support and without backup, at all hours of the early wee morning, to offer a level of protection to property and persons all over the country. And that is what, quite simply, this legislation is about, Madam Speaker. So what we're seeking to do via this legislation is to protect the workers. So quite contrary to what was being suggested, that this would lead to a loss of jobs, this is about protection not only of jobs, but more importantly, protection of lives. Protection of lives of some in our society who unfortunately, up to this point in time, had no proper protection, whilst they were being called upon to perform these tasks associated with private security officers of all different levels. And I'd like to start by commending the member for Laventille West for the work that he took on personally in driving this process. Because you see, it must go on the Hansard, Madam Speaker, that the member for Laventille West saw this particular assignment as being an essential and important one. And he himself went and drove the work by sitting for many hours, not only with the staff from the Attorney General and Legal Affairs Office, but also with the staff of National Security. And I'd like to thank all of the members of staff who assisted in the production of this piece of work. And this legislation here today captures all of the necessary elements for the protection of the industry, but also of the public. Because you see, if the men and women working in this industry are properly protected, Madam Speaker, and they feel protected, and the law protects them, then the public is better served. And yes, we in national security have a close relationship with these private security firms. Some of them, the bigger, more reputable ones. But there are many, many, many security firms in Trinidad and Tobago that over a period of time, over decades, were granted authorization by national security to commence their firms. And this piece of legislation, this bill, seeks now to regulate the whole industry. So let's start. 11 meetings. A lot of weather made, a lot of noise made about the fact that on the 11th meeting, which was the only meeting in this session, was where the report was finalized and certain persons were missing. But as the member for Oropouche East told the population he attended over 90% of the meetings. And at none of those meetings was anybody prevented from contributing and to making their points. And when you start by looking at the report, Madam Speaker, and you go through the key issues expressed by members and stakeholders, and it talks about explanation provided, or bill appropriately amended, or issue revolved, it is being a little dishonest to suggest that under those lines, the explanation isn't provided. Issues. What that is a synopsis of what went on at the meetings. So, for example, at the meetings I attended, the member for Pointe-a-Pierre made a number of pertinent inquiries, suggestions, etc. And then we would sit down along with the independent senator, along with others on the committee, and we would work through the reasoning why. And I think a good example of that is one of the last points raised by the member for Oropouche East. He talked about the peace enforcement officer. And again, in his typical style, highlighted and made noise about what is a peace enforcement officer. I recall that meeting, and the member for Pointe-a-Pierre is smiling because he recalls it as well. For the population, and to show you how well thought out this bill is, and how it took into consideration the submissions, the sensible submissions of all who participated. This is a great example in the definition of a peace enforcement officer. We've just come out of a carnival period. We've just come out of a period where hundreds of thousands of revelers take to the streets all across Trinidad and Tobago. And in Port of Spain in particular, there are a number of large bands. And part of my duty was to be out there and to see how things that we've been planning for months were functioning. And I remember looking at some of these large bands and seeing thousands of revelers walking, partying on the streets safely. The first line of defense were these peace enforcement officers. So for the first time, legislatively, peace enforcement officers is definition given to the men and the women who provide private security by something as simple as walking alongside these bands and ensuring that the revelers who have paid to participate in the carnival bands were safe. They had never before been recognized or protected, and we are doing that here today. But of course, in the typical fashion and style, because it is legislation that requires the support of the opposition, we have to come here and hear, if you want our support, do this. You didn't take me on, you had 11 meeting and we weren't there, but everybody participated. And I challenge the members to show what it is in this bill that has not been amended, that was not considered. Because you see, to make a point or to have an alternate view that is not accepted, Madam Speaker, does not mean it is a fatal flaw to legislation. So let's read into the Hansard. Peace enforcement officer means an individual employed A, to prevent individuals from entering premises or to eject individuals from premises, or B, to guide or cordon off individuals during an event. So these officers, as we've called them for the first time, are those, for example, who hold ropes or who hold a line along a carnival band to prevent outsiders from interfering with paid revelers. But it also encaptures, and the member for Point 14 for Pointe-a-Pierre would recall this, it captures persons at events, for example, in big stadiums or in concerts away, etc., who are not private security officers as we know them. They're not walking around with they might just have a fluorescent jacket on over them, and they're directing a crowd to make sure that people are safe, to ensure they're ushering crowds, and they exist. And what we're doing here today to show via one simple example how far-reaching this bill is, how necessary it is, and how well thought out it is, I will use that example from the member of Oropouche East. A lot of noise was made about Clause 8 and the board For the first time, what we're saying is we will regulate the private security industry, and we will set up an authority to do so. And for the population, through you, Madam Speaker, the sole purpose of this authority and its resources are to regulate this industry, to regulate the 30-odd thousand officers who exist. That is their only duty. So it is not to say that the vetting process that we've put 60 days at for the grant of a license, either to the firm or to an officer, is something that the authority and its personnel should not be able to do, because that is the only duty they have. So the first line of attack, which is very easy to discard of, having listened to it and thought about it, is the composition of the authority itself. So we heard a lot of fuss about workers not being represented, and it doesn't have to be a union, but contradicting, on the other hand, in the next sentence by saying there are a number of bodies that represent these unions. I assume that means like a NATOC, a FITON, but those are unions. They're the JTUM, they're the representatives of the union, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it is provided for. Because you see, in looking at this, the chairman and deputy chairman, each of whom shall be an attorney at law of at least 10 years standing and appointed by the JLSC. That is fine. The whole purpose of the authority is to regulate. So you're saying that lawyers have something special in the interpretation of law, protection of rights. That's their job. You then go down to the commissioner or a police officer, the rank of assistant commissioner. Again, that is very sensible to have the police participating at the board level of the authority. They are the experts in law enforcement. They are the ones who would bring to the table that level of expertise that is necessary. Because understand, all the authority is there for is to regulate. They're not doing anything more than that, to ensure that the industry is working properly. The next one, a representative of the ministry with responsibility for labor. There can be no better body that does not have a vested interest in the protection of workers than the Ministry of Labor. Unions, as we know, in the choice of unions in this country, there is not a single body that represents the views of all unions. There are fights and disputes amongst the bodies of unions, even those three largest representative bodies. They don't see eye to eye. The Ministry of Labor's purpose is to protect both the workers and the employers. So that is immediately captured. To try and mislead the population and say that the workers wouldn't have a say and the employers wouldn't have a say is false. The Ministry of Labor is best suited to conduct that. The next position is a representative of the business sector who is not associated with private security industry. This is a regulatory body. Suppose now this body needs to decide whether to take away a license from somebody in the industry. How could you have somebody who is from the industry, an owner of a company in the industry? Suppose now they want to lead the charge, because this is a multi-million-dollar industry. This is a multi-million-dollar industry. The contracts in some of these companies get are worth millions, tens of millions of dollars. So suppose now the person sitting on the board, who is the owner of one of these companies, Company X, wants to get rid of his competitors, Y and Z. Isn't that a clear conflict of interest? So what we say is, no, have somebody from the business sector who's not associated with the private security industry. If I am the owner of the second largest company, and the member for Laventille West is the owner of the first, and I am sitting on the board, and I want to get the contracts he is getting, I can maneuver via the board to get him out. So we said, no, we're not allowing that. Have somebody sensible from the business sector sit here. Because at the end of the day, we should all know what a board does. They don't get into the nitty-gritty. They're driving policy. But if you have any fear that they have no room for representation, it is the next clause, the next 8(1)(e), that allows now 4 other persons suitably qualified by virtue of their knowledge of and experience in matters relating to the private security industry. Maybe it is that the member for Oropouche East wasn't prepared. Maybe it is in that 11 meeting he decided I wasn't going to read what they sent. I don't know. But exactly what he was complaining about is fully captured by this. 4 other persons suitably qualified by virtue of their knowledge of and experience in matters relating to the private security industry. So that captures the whole of what he spent 25 minutes screaming to the high heavens about. But I understand, because you see, you could have a degree in law but never practice law before. So you don't know about the application of law. Right? So then we go on to worker protection. Another point made. Worker protection should be part of the act. And a lot of noise about it. But quickly said, it is a little part. The whole purpose of the act is to protect workers and to protect the public.
That's right, that's right.
And I've just talked about the composition of the board and how it achieves that. Another point that was made, you should have OSH, a representative of OSH, on the board. Completely with the greatest of respect for the member of Oropouche East in this instance, and only in this instance. No more than that. OSH has overreaching jurisdiction over everything in Trinidad. So to put a member of OSH on the board is nonsensical, because you'll then be asking a member of OSH to be in a conflict position. The whole purpose of the Occupational Safety and Health Authority Act is to empower that body to go anywhere, including to the Parliament, including to the constituency office for the member for Oropouche East, and to check and see and to make sure it's a safe environment. So why would you have a member on the board that the member on the board now finds himself in conflict? Because I've seen it before. That OSH has gone in now to private security firms, is checking to see whether they're safe, they're secure, they're providing for their employees, and then pressure is put on the board member from OSH. No, OSH is a separate entity. OSH is an independent entity. You know, Madam Speaker, what that point brought home to me, and it sums it up in my mind, the attack on the independence of certain bodies. And we've seen it time and time again. So that is the reason why OSH is not part. Yes, and you heard it. I was about to call some examples, but you just heard the member for Naparima. The first utterance as I talk about an attack on an independent body, EBC. That is what Naparima says. So let the record reflect that that is immediately where the mind is. So OSH doesn't have to be on the board. OSH already has the jurisdiction in law to protect. Rubbish point. Exploitation of workers. And they like to throw out these catchphrases to try and pretend that there's some association with the ground, and we're here to protect the workers, and we're here to protect those who are less fortunate, etc. The whole purpose of the legislation is to protect the workers. So to come here and talk about no overtime, no food and water, no relief, and you must take on another shift without even bread and cheese, and it's too bureaucratic, all of these are catchphrases that are being thrown out there, but with no substance. They have no anchoring, Madam Speaker, in the legislation that is before us. Right? And I say it for the record and for those listening and for all of the workers and for the Estate Association, Constables Association that are here. The purpose of this legislation is to protect your membership, as you know. The purpose of this legislation, Madam Speaker, I will talk to who I want. The purpose of this legislation, Madam Speaker, the purpose of this legislation, as I will say again, is to protect the workers in this industry and to protect the public. The old talk about how do you give licenses to 30,000 people. The purpose of the authority is to regulate it. As an example, we, in a 2-week period, with all of the screaming from high heavens, all of the persons who said it couldn't be done, and it is now, maybe not for some people who are upset about the success of the registration process, but it is now being utilized as a prime example of how to get a registration process done. In 2 weeks, we were able to register 16,523 Venezuelans. And these are people, 30,000 in 60 days. They will be able to do it. The authority must be able to do it, and that is their job. That is what they're set up to do. I heard the utterance. One of the persons recently in a private security company with respect to the airport, because you see, this is what they like to do. Create a sense of panic, fear-mongering, attack institutions, so now the airport isn't secure, etc. One of the persons in a private security company was a person of interest to the police. Well, that is the reason we're having the legislation. The legislation talks about regulating persons who are going to get licenses to own the firms with a more robust process, that presently applies. And there's now a process with consequences. And what this process says is it grants you a license for 3 years. So it forces the people, which doesn't exist now, because it was a member for Pointe-a-Pierre who asked in one of our meetings, with all of these hundreds of firms that are registered, are they required to keep interfacing with the Ministry of National Security? The answer is no. You get your license, you run off. And it was only if something goes wrong, there's an intervention, and not necessarily an intervention by the Ministry of National Security. So for the first time, what this legislation is doing is telling the firms, after you get over the hurdles, you've been vetted, you've been approved, and you get a license, you have to come back every 3 years. Very sensible. Things happen. Maintain standards. Keep people on their heels, make sure they're doing the right thing. There are consequences. If you don't fulfill those consequences, Madam Speaker, you will lose your license. It does not currently exist. That is what we're putting this in place for. This cry of excessive bureaucracy. I guess you had to find some sort of catchphrase to attack the legislation. A license procedure, a regulatory body must have some level of bureaucracy. Where is the excessive bureaucracy? Not a single example of what is excessive bureaucracy with this bill could have been provided. Just throw out the words, it sounds nice. You have to get a license. This is what you need to do to apply. This is what you need to provide. You get it, and you go on with your business. But you're going to be regulated. You have to account. Another point that was made was an attack on the chief executive officer. And what are the qualifications for the chief executive officer? So I immediately went to the bill. Clause 22. The board shall appoint a chief executive officer on such terms and conditions as it determines. That makes sense. 22.2. A person appointed as chief executive officer shall, and we set it out here. What are the qualifications? A, have at least 10 years experience in law enforcement or security. B, possess graduate qualifications in finance, marketing, or business administration. And C, have been positively vetted by the board. What better do you need for a CEO of this authority than what I've just set out? And what you're seeing here is amendments to the qualifications, you know. So I want to put on record, Madam Speaker, through you, that means that at the Joint Select Committee stage, submissions were made by members. Those submissions were taken on board with respect to the qualifications or lack of qualifications, lack thereof, of the CEO, and it was amended, and that is what we're proposing here today. So why come here? Why come here now to try and mislead? I have it here. He was referring from, now you see he has a style. He's just throw. Right? That is the member for Oropouche. He's making a set of noise now as usual. Because he's been shown to the population once again to be completely wrong. Right? The Chief Executive Officer shall be responsible for the day-to-day administration of the authority and shall perform such functions as may be conferred on him by the board. So it is all captured there. The board shall appoint a suitably qualified person who is positively vetted. So for the first time in this industry, you're calling upon the persons who will be running the authority on a day-to-day basis to be positively vetted. That is a good step. That is a step in the right direction, Madam Speaker. Right? So what is the attack? Right? And as they go on, what you're then getting into with this, Madam Speaker, is that I wanted to spend some time on the security service operators. These are the firms that are now called upon to be licensed. And for the first time, out of these hundreds of firms that are currently registered, you're saying no. No person shall offer or provide security services as a security service operator unless A, it is a company, B, none of its directors was convicted of an indictable offense within the past 5 years, and C, it is the holder of an operator's license. And I want to point out to the population that here, once again, in the report that is before you, there are amendments made to the original bill in this instance. So it shows that once again, there was proper consultation, discussion, and that amendments were made. And I'd like to put onto the record, to support the member for Laventille West, we had extensive consultation with the stakeholders in the industry. They came and they sat before us in a joint select committee. They made their points. They sent in extensive written submissions. I wish we had a copy here today to show how extensive it was. And we listened to them. We listened to the industry. Now, they're going to be competing interests. Because what may be the interest of the employer, the owner of the firm, is not necessarily going to be in the best interest of the worker. But we listen to all. And you see some of the representatives here today because it affects them up in the public gallery, Madam Speaker, and I welcome them here today, and I'm happy to see them here. The Estate Police Association, because they know the hardships that some of their members face, injured on the job, no insurance to provide for them, so no status. I can say that there is a lot of anecdotal allegations that right now in the industry, there are use of a lot of illegal immigrants, persons who don't have work permits. This legislation for the first time specifies that you could lose your license if you engage in that type of behavior. Why not tell the population that is what this is about? This is not, as the member for Laventille West said, this is not about P&M. There's no P&M security firm. I know that there was a UNC security firm. Mamu bought it. Yes. EBSL. Right? Criteria for an issuance of operator's license. And this is where we set out the 60 days. That you have 60 days to evaluate and to decide whether you're granting the license or not. But as I've said, Madam Speaker, the answer to that concern is that is one of the authorities' key and critical jobs and duties, and they will get it done. There's nothing else for them to be doing. They don't need to be checking the roadsides. They don't need to be inspecting police stations, etc. So the granting of licenses will be done in 60 days. And at 35(1), an operator's license shall be valid for 3 years. Completely commendable, necessary in my view, to keep the process of having them report to the authority going and to ensure that they continue to maintain the standards of their license. security officers is the next section I want to go to, Madam Speaker. Part 8 of the bill. And again,
Member for Port Spain North, St. Anne's West, your original speaking time is now spent. You're entitled to 15 more minutes to wind up your presentation. Yes, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Nice analysis. Beautiful. Beautiful.
So now we're getting to the protection of the security officers, who right now, as I said a short while ago, there is no requirement in law for them unless they're going to be precepted to carry a firearm. So what we have are instances right now on unscrupulous security firms and companies hiring illegal immigrants, presumably exploiting them, minimum wage, maybe even less, because they will tell them you can't complain to the authorities because you're here illegally and you could be, right? You could be deported. But of course, charging for the provision of the service, industry standards. So all they're doing is increasing their margins at the exploitation of these people. So that is what this legislation is here. So we're saying you cannot hire those persons. That is not about loss of jobs. What you're now saying to the persons is go out there and get licensed. Make sure that you're not going to be exploited. Follow the law. This is for your protection. So it says at clause 43, an individual who wishes to offer or provide a security service listed in part 1 of Schedule 3, other than as a close protection officer. Again, I pause there, Madam Speaker. A great example of this legislation is it is for the first time recognizing that there are different services provided in private security service. So you may have a static guard, you may have a close protection officer who the public will know as a bodyguard, you have the peace enforcement officer, you have private investigators. So we've categorized for the first time the different categories of private security services being offered, and this is what you require. So they apply for the license. You should be not less than 18 years. You haven't been convicted on an indictable offense, nationally or internationally, and you have not been convicted of more than 3 years summary offenses within 10 years immediately preceding the date of the application. You can apply for the issuance of a security officer's license. And again, say within 60 days of receiving the application, you'd either be granted or not granted the license. So, of course, the reason, and again, I'll point out because the population can't see what it is we're looking at, this whole section of what is required as a preliminary qualification to become a security officer is amended. So again, that is a clear indication of the work of the committee, that when the bill was presented to the committee, there was discourse, there was discussion, and after consultation with the stakeholders as well, amendments were made along these lines, right? This is one of the important ones. So before, all it had said is an individual who has not been convicted of an indictable offense. So there were a whole category, because you see, you can elect, for some serious offenses, you can elect whether you want to have your matter heard summarily or indicted.
Just stating here. Thank you, Madam Chair. I see you have here 3 summary offenses within a 10-year period. You really think that you want somebody to run a security company with 3? Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
I'm not now on who is running a security company. I'm now on who can be a security guard. So you don't want to just categorize, because a lot of the persons who perform these duties may have been convicted of certain summary offenses, obscene language, driving without a permit, driving without insurance, and we don't want to just make them unemployable now. So it is only for that category of workers. And again, we employ the same 3-year time frame here, Madam Speaker. So we're saying stay within the confines of the law, because within 3 years, you'll have to come back to get another license. If you've fallen on the wrong side, you're not going to be employable in this area. Special security officers, part 9. So for the first time, as I said a short while ago, Madam Speaker, we have categorized, because we're dealing with the pragmatic side now, that they are close protection officers, peace enforcement officers, or private investigators, and we are requiring them to have a special security officer's license. There are a whole series of people out there who hold themselves out now as private investigators, and they are not licensed. This is where we are trying to protect the public. There are also persons out there who hold themselves out as close protection officers. So they'll say, member for Caroni East, I will be your bodyguard. And he may be none the wiser. But what we're doing now is we're protecting you because we're saying they have to be licensed. They'll have to have a certain level of training to ensure that they don't go and fleece people out there. So, Madam Speaker, contrary to what we've heard previously, it is my submission that the work of your committee that was set up to carry out the examination of the bill did so. They did so after extensive consultation, not only with stakeholders, but also with others. They did so, and at those committee meetings, the chairman listened, we discussed, amendments were made where it was felt amendments should be made. And up to this point in time, I have not heard a single justifiable submission as to what further amendment is necessary. But I will say, because I've heard the conversation between the chairman and the Attorney General, that the government is not close to considering if anything justifiable and legitimate is put forward for amendments to this. But at the end of the day, this piece of legislation, which is long overdue, is all about protection and regulation of an industry that requires it. One of the other points that was made that should be responded to is the point that talks about things being tax-free. So what the authority is buying is being tax-free. And ironically, as I sat and I listened, I seen that sounded familiar. And it was when we were doing the public procurement legislation and we were in opposition. And we looked at that same clause. And we were saying, but you're creating this body, and as usual, why are we giving a body the opportunity to be tax-free? Will they abuse it, etc.? There is no piece of law, no piece of legislation that is passed that stops anyone from abusing it. Because by definition, the fact that people break law means that they don't necessarily respect the law. For the authority to get up, get off its feet, do what it needs to be done, it is felt by us as legislators that there is nothing abnormal, nothing unusual, and they can be granted the same facility. Is there going to be oversight? The answer is yes. Because at the end of the day, before they can spend money, they need to get the money. So there's a budgeting process, the national budgeting process that will give them subventions, their line items. It will be looked at how the money is expended. They will be audited. They will have to produce a report for the Minister of National Security. The Minister of National Security has the right and can always ask the Minister of Finance to send in the Central Audit Committee, as we have done as an administration. Time and time again, when there's any allegation, we believe that there may be misspending, etc. There is no need to worry or create a sense of panic that there's any lack of accountability. There's nothing unusual with this provision. So again, that is the response to that. So, Madam Speaker, in summary and in conclusion, I say there should be no justifiable fear in us getting on with what is long overdue. I heard it suggested by a previous speaker, it may have been the member for Oropouche East, that this industry is 50 years old in Trinidad. 50 years old, unregulated, exploiting potentially some of the most vulnerable in our society in their jobs and their job places. Now is the time for us to get on with it. There is nothing that is frightening in this piece of legislation, nothing of concern. But as I say, if we miss something, I haven't heard anything so far, we are prepared to listen, and it is not too late for amendments to be made in those circumstances. Madam Speaker, with those few words, I thank you.
Member for Point of Peace.